Okay, good. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. I would like to welcome you to our fourth edition of the Symposium on Husserlian Phenomenology. This symposium was conceived by Flávio Curvello to promote research and debate on topics concerning the interpretation of Edmund Husserl's phenomenology. It is being held in conjunction with the Symposium on Mind, Cognition and Phenomenology, which aims at fostering the debate on the philosophy of mind, especially but not exclusively related to the phenomenological tradition. Previous editions of both events received contributions by Alice Serra, Stephen Gouvea, Joseph Ledoux, Lilian Alves, Giovanni Rolla, Andrea Bat, Sheila Tomé, Célia Cabreira, among others. So far, the editions have been online, not all of them, but some of them. But we hope to make it an in-person event in Brazil so as to welcome researchers from all over the world who are interested in these topics. In yesterday's session, we had a presentation by Salius Geniuses. In the next hour, we'll have a talk from Zixuan Liu. Before passing the microphone, I would like to introduce him. Zixuan Liu is a PhD candidate at Husserlarchiv Cologne. Since 2022, he's working on the project Husserls Erweiterung des Willensbegriffs und ihre Bedeutung für die Handlungstheorie under the supervision of Professor Dr. Jagna Brudzinska. He graduated with a master's degree from Sun Yat-sen University. His research interests lie in the intersection between Husserlian phenomenology on the one hand and analytic metaphysics, action theory, and neuroscience on the other hand. His publications include On the Unique Relationality of Intention as the Origin of Husserlian Transcendentality, a Laskin Critique of Phenomenal Intentionality, and How Agency is Constitutive of Phenomenal Consciousness, pushing the first and the third personal approaches to their limits. Thank you very much, Liu, for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction, Rodrigo, and thank you, Paulo and Flavio, for the invitation. So let me just share my screen. Is it possible to share my screen?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Okay, you can see that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So today I'm going to talk about a topic in Husserl, namely his idea of absolute individuation and a debate around the interpretation of this idea. So, so let me first introduce the topic of individuations. Most of the time, you can find the literature discussing Husserl's notion of individuation of non-subjects. So, such as how entities and actual fantasy worlds individualize via spatial propositions, and how experiences individual about phenomenological time. I guess that many of you are very familiar with these ideas. But much less attention has been paid to the individuation of subjects, although this has been done by Husserl himself and also by certain authors recently. So what I'm focusing on is how Husserl discussed the individuation of the subject. Now, he proposed a thesis of absolute individuation of the subject. Why does he propose such an idea? So we have to first understand his motivation. In idea two, he contrasted the subject with non-subjects in terms of historicity. He would say that a subject has a history, whereas entities in the physical world are historyless. To explore this idea, Husserl tried to introduce the framework of individuation. And he said that there are two different individualities. One is individuality in a spiritual sense, and the other is natural individuality. They are very different. Okay, then he says something like the following. the environment of the self obtains its individuation via its relationship with the self, who has an experience of it. So this is Husserl's idea of absolute individuation, which I will also explore further later. We can summarize this idea in three parts. First of all, Husserl is arguing that the subject does not individualize via spatial temporal position, either in the world or even experiential spatial temporal positions such as the phenomenological time. Rather, he's suggesting the subject has its own, a distinctive principle of individuation. But what is it? That is the question. Second, this principle of individuation for the subject applies first and foremost to the subject that is not a part of the world, the pure self, and then derivatively to the subject in the world, the personal self. And third, very importantly, Husserl is arguing that all non-subjects, like the environment of the self, all non-subjects individualize only in relation to the subjects in a certain sense. In other words, the subject is the ultimate principle of individuation. It is not the spatial temporal position, but the subject in itself. He says something like this: the world vis-a-vis a subject individualized, but its individuation is secondary, while the original, the absolute individuation lies in self. This is something already heralded by Husserl around 1905 in his Ziegfeld manuscript. He says something like this: the continuity of space and time is not a complete individuator, thus for individualisierende. Rather, that complete, that ultimate individuator is self-individuality. Now, the problem is how to interpret this idea of absolute individuation. We have here mainly two interpretations. One is what I call qualitative, and the other is what I call extra qualitative. Now, these interpretations are debating around one sentence here. Husserl said the subject has something absolutely individual in itself. Now, the problem is, how should we understand this in itself? One interpretation of in itself suggests that the subject's individuation defies the distinction between differentiation and individuation, which I will explain later. It means that every subject individualized via its distinctive quality rather than some extra qualitative factor. So here, in itself is read as contrasting with extra qualitatively, and I call this qualitative interpretation of absolute individuation. So admittedly, Husserl himself does endorse this interpretation, and because of this, following Husserl, most interpreters of Husserlian absolute individuation endorse the qualitative interpretation. For instance, you can see Daniel de Santis. He will say that the ego has an ontological concreteness or intrinsic individuation, which means there's a coincidence between the universal of the lowest level and its individuality. By contrast, I'm here arguing for an alternative interpretation, which I called extra qualitative interpretation. So this interpretation will say that in itself does not mean does not contrast with extra qualitatively, rather contrast with what is not the subject. That is, the subject is not individuated by something else, by spatial temporal positions, which are not identical with the subject. Rather, the subject is itself a principle of individuation. Well, I would say this is a minority view so far, but I have at least one Husserlian on my side, namely James Hart. He explicitly promotes the extra qualitative interpretation. He will say that the self is not is individuated per se by myself. It's not individuated by any quality or by being space-time or by reason of causality or by contrast with others. Rather, we should not conceive the subject's most basic individuality in subtle terms. So in these kind of individualities, is rather a propertyless or qualityless individuality. So this is the idea that I wish to argue for here. Now, before going to these details of my arguments, I wish to say something about my methodology here. First, I would have no quarrel with the qualitative interpretation if all it took to be a Husserlian were just to repeat what Husserl said. But if a Husserlian must examine the validity of Husserl's argument and overcome the inconsistency between different parts of his system, then I must raise some serious objection to this interpretation. And second, Husserl was always experimenting with different theoretical options, hence it is unwise to label one view as the genuine Husserlian orthodox view and discuss other interpretative possibilities. It is more fruitful to let Husserl's different insights collide with each other to catalyze a philosophically sound and inspiring proposal. So this is my methodology here, and how I'm going to argue for my thesis here. First of all, I'm going to present a distinction between qualitative and extra-qualitative distinction, because if I want to talk about something like qualitative interpretation, extra-qualitative interpretation, what does this distinction really mean? So here I wish to explore this distinction first. And second, I'm going to show that Husserl himself does endorse the extra-qualitative theory of individuation regarding non-subjects. This is in comparison, but Husserl will say that in the case of subjects, we should endorse the qualitative interpretation, and his argument for this is the habitualization. And afterwards, I'm going to show that this argument is very problematic. Why would Husserl endorse such a problematic interpretation? And then in section 6, I'm going to show Husserl's motivation for this qualitative interpretation. And finally, I'm going to propose my own idea of extra qualitative interpretation. So first of all, how does Husserl understand the qualitative and extra qualitative distinction? He used terms like constitutive determinations and principial individuations. And constitutive determination, according to Husserl, are universals that can appear in totally identical manners in arbitrarily many instances. Here, Husserl would include two subspecies in constitutive determinations of qualitative properties. One subspecies is spatial and temporal species, or the universal of spatial and temporal positions. And second is the contents that are extended along this extension, such as redness. And these constitutive determinations have different instances. The instances of spatial-temporal species is spatial-temporal positions, and the species of these contents are qualities such as redness that individuals indirectly, namely by virtue of the individuation of spatial-temporal positions. Now, you may have a puzzle here. Are spatial-temporal positions qualitative or extra-qualitative? So here, according to this idea, Husserl will say spatial temporal positions are qualitative. But if we consider the instances, he's saying that spatial temporal positions are extra qualitative. So are they qualitative or extra qualitative? So this is something that you may feel puzzling at first glance. I would say this is not some confusion or ambiguity. Rather, it highlights the context dependence of the qualitative extra-qualitative distinction. Namely, if we are discussing spatial temporal positions as particulars that individualize the instances of qualities in a narrow sense, namely color, then we will call spatial temporal positions extra-qualitative. But if we are talking about another questions, we are discussing the instances of spatial temporal universals as being individuated by some other particulars, which I would say is the subject afterwards, then spatial temporal positions are characterized as qualitative in this context. So in other words, we have a hierarchy of individuation. Depending on the context, one can characterize spatial temporal positions either as qualitative or extra qualitative, but it should not lead to confusions. To summarize, we can say that X is qualitative and Y is an actual qualitative principium individuationis if Y is a particular, the individual is an instance of X. So this is context-dependent distinction. And in the following, I will also use this distinction to discuss the debate between qualitative and actual qualitative distinction. Now, you may have a worry here. Why should we say that there are universals of spatial-temporal positions? Are they not individual rather than universals? Who will say, well, for the following reason, we should talk about spatial-temporal universals, because one can investigate spatial-temporal positions in geometry. They must have corresponding universals, which are still universals, rather than individual entities. Every spatial point has an essence, and the geometrical relations between different points are grounded in this essence. But what are these essences? Husserl would say, consider two particular spatial-temporal positions, O and A, in the same spatial continuum. He asks, what is differentiated when one travels from the move from O to A? And Husserl answered, the essence of O. What does it mean? It means that each spatial-temporal position in a particular spatial-temporal continuum is not just an instance of general universal, rather general spatial-temporal position, but also an instance of a distinct maximally spatial-temporal universal. So he's saying that each spatial-temporal position in the same row instantiates a different lower species, or what we so call specific difference of the genus, essence, duration, or spatial extension. But there's a problem for Husserl, which will be important in the following. If you say that the lowest spatial-temporal specification still belongs to the constitutive discrimination because it can be arbitrarily duplicated, then you may ask Husserl, how is this duplication possible? It is impossible to do this within the same world because according to Husserl, each spatial-temporal position in the same world instantiates a different maximally specific universal, different lowest species. Then Husserl will answer, this duplication is only possible across different fantasy worlds. So you can imagine numerically distinct fantasy worlds with instances of the same spatial-temporal universal. So this will be important in the following. Now, let's go into the third part. Husserl, in fact, endorsed the extra qualitative theory of individuation in the case of non-subjects. So he would say that the specific, namely the constitutive denomination of the qualitative property, does not turn an object into an individual this, because the lowest species could still be actualized in unlimitedly many particular cases. In other words, the maximal specific universal alone does not suffice to individuate its instances. We need further particulars for their individuation. So this is the argument from qualitative indiscernible duplicates. So if such qualitative duplicates are possible, then the lowest species alone cannot individuate and the instance of this universal. So this possibility comes from Husserl's distinction between individuation and differentiation. He would say differentiation means the movement, for instance, from the genus color to the species drag, and then finally to the maximal specific shape, what Husserl called niedrigste Differenz. But even the lowest species is still a universal, whose instance individualizes in the manner of simple repetition. Now, here Husserl will distinguish between three cases in this extra qualitative theory of individuation. First of all, he would say, well, we have an entity in actual world, and for such an entity, such as an apple, the individuality lies in this here and now, lies in spatial temporal positions, and several things with totally indiscernible properties and causal states can occur at different times and locations. So this is the first case. And second, we have the entity in the fantasy world. Husserl would say something like this: the redness of Harry Potter's robe can in principle be the same as the redness of James Bond's blood. So two instances can be qualitatively the same, but numerically different. So this is the second case. Here I would like to say something more about the second case because it is related to the analytic metaphysics of possible world. So let me characterize the relationship between this Husserlian view on fantasy worlds and the contemporary debates of possible worlds as follows. So first of all, Husserl will distinguish between Umfantasieren and free fantasy. What does it mean? Umfantasieren, for instance, Husserl would say this is think otherwise, such as J.F. Kennedy was in fact murdered, but let's think otherwise. Let's think that this did not happen in the history. So this is Umfantasieren. It means modifying, thinking about alternative to actuality. So this is Umfantasieren. A different mode of fantasy is free fantasy. Just like you can imagine Harry Potter, imagine James Bond, these fantasy worlds have no relation to each other. They are isolated to each other. So for this reason, this distinction roughly resembles the difference between Kripke's and Lewis' conceptions of possible worlds. So Kripke considered possible worlds as ways the world might have been, or states of the actual worlds. These ways are stipulated as alternatives to the actual world. And this is what Husserl said, Umfantasieren. But in Lewis, these possible worlds are spatial, temporally, and causally isolated, and that's why I would say they are similar. Second, Husserl is a concretist regarding fantasy worlds because he would say that entities in fantasy worlds are individuated by their spatial temporal positions. Third, I said roughly resemble because Lewis is not consistent with himself. He actually construed possible world in a mixed mode of Umfantasieren and free fantasy, although he allows the possibility of qualitative indiscernible worlds in some places. He denies it elsewhere. And for this reason, some authors has explored this tension in Lewis and said that you should either go for something like the Husserlian conception of free fantasy or go to the Kripke's understanding. Finally, Husserl is not an anti-realist concerning non-actual entities since it admits the as of existence. Now, the third case here is, Husserl will say, even experiences individualize via spatial temporal position. But these spatial temporal positions are not physical spatial temporal position, rather they are experiential spatial temporal position. He says something like this: an experience individualized via phenomenological time. And second, even if an experience lacks genuine experiential space as a form of temporal coexistence, does not lack the form of experiential coexistence in general, however difficult it is to describe this form. So in C manuscript, he say that this experiential space is a unified exterior to one another, which belongs to every experiential temporal point. So this is the third part. I want to say something very shortly about the connection between this position and the traditional discussion of hygienics and hygienicism, such as in Duns Curtis and current analytic metaphysics like Adams, Max Black. So different from the traditional definition of thisness as the properties of being an individual X or being identical to X, which is endorsed by Adams, I would say thisness in this paper and what I presented here should be interpreted as one-offness, as Husserl said, Einmaligkeit, which we will also discuss later. An entity is numerically distinct from another entity that instantiates the same maximally specific universal by virtue of its one-offness. So it means that the entity is one-off because repeated instantiation of the same universal does not entail the read identification of its instances. This is also how some authors like Woo Park, a Korean philosopher, will interpret uh, Duns Scotus' notion of hygienics. So thisness is contrastively construed as non-thatness. How is this position related to traditional understanding of hygienic and hygietism? First of all, I would say that here thisness is in context dependent, is involved in a hygienics structure of individuation, but this is impossible for the traditional understanding of hygienics being X or being identical to X. Second, this interpretation of thisness allows qualitative contribution to the identity of an entity. What I mean by extra qualitative individuation is only that qualitative properties alone do not suffice to individuate an entity. But I will allow for qualitative properties to contribute to the identity of an entity. This is not impossible in a traditional sense. Hence, if all that matters hierarchism is the acknowledgement of thisness and qualitative indiscernible but numerically distinct possible worlds, then I endorse a certain form of hierarchism. But if you ask more from me, then I am not a hierarchist. So now I have presented the extra qualitative theory of individuation above. What about why would Husserl say endorse the qualitative interpretation in the case of the individuation of subjects? So he would say something like this. The ego cannot be repeated as a string of purely possible coexisting and absolutely identical egos because the total complex of personal traits is not repeatable. Consequently, the most specific concrete universe of the ego individuates itself. This is how Husserl understands. He means that personal traits, personal characters of two different subjects can never be the same. What might provide support for Husserl's claim? He's in fact worried about this self becoming an empty pose. For this reason, he insists that the subject is a carrier of habituality. And here he argues for absolute individuation in the following way. He says that each subject has its own self because of habituation. Every self purely taken as self has its individuality, such that the total sameness is already necessarily excluded because of habituation. Now, what I'm going to do in the following is to examine whether this argument holds or not. We can reconstruct this argument as follows. Because personal character is a result of habituation, its qualitatively indiscernible instantiation in two individual subjects is impossible. As was said, total sameness regarding personal traits is necessarily excluded. Hence, the subject need not individualize for something other than the lowest level species of personal characters. Is this argument valid? I would say no. Why? First of all, we can see that there's an ambiguity within premise one. What does it mean that it's impossible to have qualitatively indiscernible instantiation of personal characters in two individual subjects? It could either refer to the impossible of multiple instantiation in fantasy or in actuality. But according to what I have presented above in the third part, the extra qualitative interpretation of individuation, only the impossibility in fantasy suffice to rule out the application of extra qualitative individuation to the subject. because Husserl's argument in the third part is based on the imagined possibility. But if one interprets premise 1 as a certainty and possibility of multiple instantiation in fantasy, then it cannot quite adequate support from habituation. Let's consider a subject whose childhood experiences have led him to develop melancholy character. So this is habituation. Then one can imagine another subject in the fantasy world undergoing qualitatively the same childhood experiences and developing a qualitatively indiscernible melancholy character as a result of habituation. So even if this habituation may preclude identical instantiation in actuality, it's still possible in fantasy. So it means that we still have ontological clone if one interprets premise 1 as referring to the impossibility in fantasy. Now, you may reply, well, let's not consider fantasy. Let's just consider actuality. Okay. But if you interpret premise 1 as referring to the impossibility in actuality, then this reply is also problematic. If you argue that because of habituation, personal characters can never be the same in actuality, then I would consider the possibility of amnesia, which can counteract the effect of habituation. A melancholy subject rent optimistic by a personal success could lose the memory of this experience in a car accident and become melancholy again. So even in actuality, habituation is insufficient to exclude the possibility of repeated instantiation of personal characters. Now you may say, well, complete amnesia is impossible in actuality. Well, let's grant it that you are correct here. But if you argue in this way, then the same may also apply to the individuation of non-subjects. A clock can returns to its original position periodically, but a repetition in every detail is also highly unlikely. The clock can wears out because of friction. Recorded at the first part, in the introduction, we have said that Husserl wants to distinguish between individuation of the subject, the geistige Individuation, and the individuation of non-subjects. But if you reply in this way that amnesia in actuality is just impossible, then there's no essential difference between the individuation of subjects and the individuation of non-subjects, because the possibility of repeated instantiation is just a matter of degree in these two cases. So this is the first argument that I have presented against the qualitative interpretation. The second argument comes from the fact that Husserl says the environment of the self obtains its individuation by the relationship with the self. In other words, the subject is the ultimate principle of individuation, explaining not only its own individuation, but also all individuation of all non-subjects. But we may just wonder, how can qualitative interpretation help us explain the extra qualitative individuation of non-subject? According to Husserl, like physical objects individualized by the spatial temporal position, this individuation is extra qualitative. How can personal characters, which is a constitutive determination, a qualitative property of the subject, contribute to extra qualitative individuation of non-subjects? I would say they have just no answer to this question. You may reply that non-subjects appear differently for different subjects depending on the subject's personal traits, such as color blindness, but color, such properties are still qualitative properties, so they can never explain how spatial temporal positions themselves could individualize by the qualitative individuation of the subject. So these are my two arguments against the qualitative interpretation. Now, why would Husserl endorse such a qualitative interpretation if it is so problematic, if it is not consistent with his own extra qualitative theory of individuation of non-subjects. Here, I will try to show Husserl's motivations. I would say he has one well-justified motivation. He said that one should give the uniqueness of subjective psychological individuality its due. I agree completely with that. Yes, the subjective individuality is unique, but unfortunately, Husserl mixes this motivation with several others. The first mixed motivation here is that a physical entity is purely determined by its external relations. Its relations to other entity exhaust its lowest specific constitutive determinations. By contrast, he argues that personal characters is not determined from outside. It rather has an eigenessence. So what Husserl is claiming here is that the subject's relations to other entities cannot exhaust all its qualitative properties, in contrast to the case of physical entities. I don't know whether this claim is correct or not, but let's grant its correctness. But it does not lead us to the qualitative interpretation, because what's discussed here is all lies within qualitative properties, is a distinction within the qualitative properties. So it has no influence, no implication on the debate between qualitative interpretation and extra qualitative interpretation. The second motivation here concerns the problem, how a genus differentiates to lowest species. Husserl argues that the lowest species of physical universals can be constructed from a given universal form by mathematical operations, but this deduction is impossible for the universal of a person. Likewise, this is still a distinction within the qualitative properties. It does not have any implication for the debate between qualitative and extra qualitative interpretation, because here we are discussing differentiation. But differentiation is different from individuation, according to Husserl. And finally, Husserl would say, nature is calculable, physical nature is mathematical, guise is not calculable. Well, I agree completely with that. But this still does not support the qualitative interpretation. It is neutral for the qualitative and extra qualitative debate. So I would say Husserl has a well-justified motivation, but unfortunately is mixed with several other motivations which also do not support the qualitative interpretation. Here, finally, I'm trying to present my own argument for my own version of extra qualitative interpretation. So I'm going to say that interpret the subject in the absolute individuation as one of second simplicity. While when I interpret in this way, I'm going to show it later. So to argue for the extra qualitative interpretation, I need to show the following advantages of my interpretation. First of all, I need to show whether it interprets the text as plausibly as the qualitative interpretation. And second, why it is more consistent with Husserl's other ideas of individuation. And I think the second will be pretty much clearer in the following discussion, and I will not say much on it. And third, how the subject under this interpretation contributes to the individuation of non-subjects. This is the second argument that I use against the qualitative interpretation, and I'm going to show that my argument or my interpretation performs better in this respect. And finally, whether this interpretation does justice to the uniqueness of subjective individuality, which is Husserl's motivation here. Now, record Husserl's proposal above of this absolute individuation. He will say the pure self already has absolute individuation which has something absolutely individual in itself. The problem is, how should we interpret this in itself? As I've said above, the qualitative interpretation suggests that in itself means constitutive determination in contrast with extra qualitative principia individuationis. But for me, as a proponent of the extra qualitative interpretation, I would say in itself means that the subject is an extra qualitative principle of individuation, thus not individualized by virtue of something else. I would just define the relevant notion of the subject in absolute individuation as follows. It means the subject, if absolute individuation, is one of second simplicity. Let me explain here. So what do I mean with one of? So one of addresses the individuality of the subject because constitutive determination, the qualitative properties, can be instantiated by multiple universals. In other words, constitutive determinations can be repeated, whereas individuality means unrepeatable one-offness, unwiederholbare Einmaligkeit. So here the one-offness is extra qualitative. So that means the repeated instantiation of qualitative properties does not entail the repeated identity of an entity. And here, second simplicity means that the absoluteness of absolute individuation. This notion of subject does not have any other determination than one-offness. I would say it is pre-spatial and pre-temporal, and for this reason, as I will argue later, it can individuate spatial temporal positions. Both interpretations are possible if no other factors are considered here. But if any interpretation, qualitative or extra qualitative, perform worse in theoretical aspect, then we should reject it. And you may wonder here whether this subject, one of second simplicity, is bare particular in contemporary metaphysics, because it's bare and it is particular. I would say it is not, because although it's bare and it's particular, it is not a substratum in the sense of contemporary metaphysics. So for this reason, Hart would not say it, also would not say it is a bad particular. Now, as I have argued against the qualitative interpretation, they cannot explain how the subject can be the ultimate principle of individuation. And I'm going to show that my extra qualitative interpretation can do this. How should we do this? So let's explore something that you can find in David Lewis. He would say that actual world is actual because it is our world, while other possible worlds are merely possible because they are not ours. Thus, actualities and possibilities are indexed to the subject. For world that we intersubjectively identify, this relevant subject can be termed us. So these instances of spatial temporal positions individualize via the relationship to this us. And I would say this indexical subject in David Lewis echoes what I call the subject of one of second simplicity here. So recall what Husserl said above. He would say that even lowest species of spatial temporal positions can be arbitrarily duplicated, but it cannot be duplicated within the same world. You have to duplicate it across different fantasy worlds. So here I would say it means that the subject, while one of simplicity, individualize these different spatial temporal positions because they are indexed to different subjects. So in fact, we can find similar proposal in current philosophy. Like Anton Friedrich Koch, who is a retired professor, he proposed a similar idea. He said, what is the principle of individuation of temporal regions? And his answer is the subject. What differentiated my spatial temporal surroundings from the qualitative indiscernible surroundings of my doppelganger is the fact that one is my surrounding and the other is his surrounding. Nonetheless, there is some essential distinction between my position and Koch's position. First of all, it's unclear whether Koch is claiming that all spatial-temporal regions within one world, or those across different possible worlds, to be qualitative indiscernible. Husserl will reject the former claim since he said that different spatial-temporal positions in the same world instantiate a different maximally specific spatial-temporal universal. But Koch, Husserl and I would rather say that spatial-temporal regions within across different possible worlds are qualitatively indiscernible. Second, Koch seems to conflate the ontological fact of individuation and the subjective act of individuating. So the subjective act of individuating is intentional experience, but the ontological fact is being intended. So to use the word of Daniel de Sandis, intentionality is not an ontological concept, but a transcendental one. It has nothing to do with being, but rather with sense. By contrast, the relationship of individuation is an ontological relation. So we can say the relationship between spatial temporal position and this sense of subject is different from the relation of intentionality. So finally, and also for this reason, I will not suffer from the critic by Hofweber against Anton Friedrich Koch. Finally, you may ask a question. Have I done justice to subject individuality? I would say yes, and even better than a qualitative interpretation. As I've argued above, if the subjective individuality consisted solely in the unlikelihood of multiple instantiation of certain constitutive determination in actuality, then this individuality would not be essentially different from that of a physical entity like a clock hand, which rotates and wears out. If Husserl wants to argue for the uniqueness or one-offness of the subject, then a qualitative interpretation does not do a good job here. By contrast, for the extra qualitative interpretation, one-offness is distinctive, even definitive of the subject. Hence, I would say my interpretation can even better do justice than a qualitative interpretation. Now, there are three objections that may arise here, and I may conclude now. The first objection is that you may say, wow, the subject in your interpretation is fragmented. It's not an identical pole that persists through time. Yes, I would say, yes, it's fragmented. But even by Husserl, even in Husserl, this notion of the diachronical identical subject is not the only legitimate one. He would say that every act has a separate self, so to speak, a separate act code, and the persistent self is united by the identity synthesis of the self. Hence, we could say that these are not in conflict with each other, but are just different strata of the subject. One-offness, second simplicity, is at the bottom layer, whereas the persistent self is at a higher layer. And this is also the difference between my view and James Hart's view. Second complaint, you may say, well, Husserl is concerned about the emptiness of the subject, but your definition of the subject is exactly the extreme empty subject. I would say, yes, it is empty, but I'm not against the qualitative characterization of the subject with personal traits. I'm only insisting that such a characterization does not exhaust the individuality of the subject and cannot explain Husserl's notion of absolute individuation. I'm rather embrace rich, complex qualitative structures upon the extra qualitative subject. For this reason, my account is compatible with concrete subjects, unless one attempts to interpret absolute individuation solely via these qualitative interpretations. So, for this reason, you may have the final complaint. This understanding of subjects seem to violate Husserl's dichotomy of subject as transcendental subjectivity and psychological subjectivity, with one of them is ultramodern, überwertlich, the other is Weltmitglied as part of the world. I would say yes. It violates this dichotomy, but it's not a bad news. Because the notion of self or subject is a thick one, and one should not assume that one or two notions of the subjects are sufficient to exhaust all the senses. The conflict of these different notions of subjects does not indicate a flaw in each notion, rather it only signals that the notion of subjects deserves subtle differentiation in line with their respective contribution. So different notions of the subjects may coincide in one individual, but they're not synonymous. So this is all of my talk. Thank you very much.